The rope hit Alberta Graves across the shoulders before she even heard the horse behind her, and she went down hard into the mud of Sweetwater Creek's bank, the breath knocked clean out of her lungs. "Got you," a man's voice said, low and satisfied, and then a knee pressed into her back and cold iron closed around one wrist before she could think to fight. She fought anyway. She twisted beneath him, spitting mud, and drove her free elbow back into something that gave with a grunt. The pressure on her back eased just enough for her to roll, and she found herself staring up into a face she did not recognize, gray eyes narrowed beneath the brim of a weathered hat, a jaw shadowed with 3 days of stubble. "You have made a terrible mistake," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was a small victory in itself. "I've got a paper says otherwise." The man reached into his coat with his free hand and produced a folded bounty notice, the paper soft and gray from being carried too long in too many pockets. "Says here a woman matching your description, riding alone, answering to the name of Delphine Wade, wanted for grand theft and fraud out of Cheyenne. $500 dead or alive, though I generally prefer alive on account of it being less paperwork. My name is Alberta Graves." She said it slow, the way a person says a thing they have said many times already and are tired of saying. "I am a journalist. I write for the Denver Republican and for 3 other papers besides. I have never in my life set foot in Cheyenne, and I have certainly never stolen anything more valuable than a good story." The man's eyes moved over her face, over the mud streaked across her cheek, over the notebook that had spilled from her satchel and lay open in the churned earth beside them, its pages soaked through with creek water and already beginning to blur. He picked it up before she could stop him and turned it toward the gray morning light. She watched something shift behind his eyes as he read, watched the certainty that had brought him crashing off his horse begin, slowly, to crumble. "You're supposed to be blonde," he said finally, and there was the faintest note of accusation in it, as though her hair color were a personal betrayal. "I have never in my life dyed anything but Easter eggs." He looked at the notice again, then back at her, then at the notebook full of her cramped, hurried handwriting, notes on land surveys and water rights, and a man named Halloran Bridge whose name appeared no fewer than 11 times on the visible pages. "Well," he said, and had the grace at least to look uncomfortable as he reached for the key at his belt, "It appears I owe you an apology, Miss Graves." The manacle came away from her wrist with a small metallic click, and Alberta Graves sat up in the cold mud of Sweetwater Creek's bank in the young spring of 1884, in the territory of Wyoming, some 40 miles north of the town of Larkspur Valley, and looked hard at the man who had just tried to drag her across 3 counties chained to his saddle. "Simon Lockhart," he said, as though his name might serve as an explanation, and touched 2 fingers to his hat brim in a gesture that under other circumstances might have been charming. "Bounty man out of Cheyenne, though not by trade. Horses is my trade. This was meant to be a favor for a friend. Some favor." She got to her feet, wringing creek water from the hem of her skirt, and retrieved what remained of her notebook from his hand with more force than was strictly necessary. Half the pages were ruined. The ink bled into illegible clouds, but the back pages, the ones with the names and dates and the careful sketch of a ledger page she had glimpsed through a lit window in Cheyenne 3 nights past, those had survived, folded as they were toward the notebook's spine. She was cataloging the damage, her mind already working out which interviews she would need to reconstruct from memory, when the sound of another horse reached them both at once, coming fast along the creek trail from the north. Simon's hand went to his hip before he'd consciously decided to move it. Alberta noted that, filed it away the way she filed away every small true thing a person's body told her that their mouth did not. The rider who came around the bend was young, perhaps 20, hatless, his horse lathered white with hard use. He hauled up so sharply that the animal nearly sat back on its haunches, and Alberta recognized him even before he spoke. Tomas Reyes, the elder son of a homestead family she had interviewed not 4 days prior, out on the western edge of Larkspur Valley. "Judge Whitfield sent me," Tomas gasped out. "He says come quick, both of you. He's heard there's a bounty man on the valley road, and he says he won't have you shooting each other before the hearing gets its witness." Simon Lockhart looked at Alberta Graves. Alberta Graves looked at Simon Lockhart. Neither of them, in that moment, had the faintest idea what the young man was talking about, but both of them understood, with the particular clarity that comes after a violent misunderstanding, that their morning was not yet finished with them. They rode together into Larkspur Valley beneath a sky the color of an old bruise, past fields still crusted with the last stubborn snow in their shaded hollows, past a creek swollen fat and brown with the spring melt, running so high it had eaten halfway up the trunks of the cottonwoods along its banks. New calves stood on unsteady legs beside their mothers in the wet pastures, and the mud sucked at the horses' hooves with every stride. And Simon Lockhart, riding a half-length behind the woman he had so recently tried to arrest, found himself watching the way she sat her borrowed horse, upright and unbothered by a morning that would have left most people he knew rattled for a week. She had refused his offer of a spare coat. She had refused, more pointedly, his offer of an apology delivered a second time, informing him that one apology was sufficient and additional repetitions only cheapened the sentiment. He liked her for that, though he was not yet ready to examine why. Judge Cornelius Whitfield's chambers occupied the back room of the Larkspur Valley Land Office, a squat frame building at the center of a town that consisted of little more than that office, a mercantile, a livery, a church, and a scattering of houses climbing the low hill above the creek. The judge himself was a broad, silver-whiskered man of some 60 years who had ridden circuit through this territory for 2 decades, and had, by his own admission, seen every manner of foolishness the frontier could produce. He did not look surprised to see them arrive together, though he did look considerably surprised at the state of Alberta Graves's ruined skirt and mud-caked boots. "I take it introductions have already been made," the judge said dryly, gesturing them both to chairs before his cluttered desk. "After a fashion," Alberta said. "He roped me off my horse," she added, when the judge's eyebrows rose in silent question. "I mistook her for a fugitive," Simon said. The description was close. "The description," Alberta said, "was for a blonde woman 5 years my junior with a scar above her left eye. I have neither the years, the hair, nor the scar." Judge Whitfield rubbed a hand across his weathered face in the manner of a man who had expected a simple morning and was rapidly revising that expectation. "Well, that is a matter for another day and another paper, and I do not have the patience for it now. What I have, Miss Graves, Mr. Lockhart, is a problem, and the two of you are about to become its solution whether you care for that arrangement or not." He unfolded a letter, its wax seal already broken, and set it on the desk between them. 3 weeks passed. A company calling itself the Larkspur Improvement and Investment Corporation began purchasing land options along this valley, from Widow Haverson's place clear down to the Ray's homestead. They are offering fair prices, on the surface. What they are not telling the families who sign is that the water rights to Sweetwater Creek, the only reliable water in this valley once the spring melt runs off, have already been quietly filed elsewhere, in the name of a man called Halloran Bridge, acting as agent for investors back east who have never once set foot on this land and likely never will. Alberta's spine straightened. "I have been investigating Halloran Bridge for 6 weeks," she said. "He has done this in 2 other valleys in this territory that I know of, and I believe a third in Colorado. He buys the land cheap from families who don't know their water rights have been severed out from under them, sells it dear to speculators once the railroad survey comes through, and leaves the original families with worthless dirt and no recourse. That fits with what little I have been able to gather," the judge said. "The trouble is proving it in a court of law with something more substantial than a journalist's notebook, however well kept. I understand you have documents." "I have a partial ledger," Alberta said carefully. copied from records I observed in the land office in Cheyenne. It shows the water rights filing predates the land purchase offers by 4 months, which means Bridge and his company knew precisely what they were doing when they made those offers. I have witnesses in 3 families willing to testify to the terms they were promised, terms that do not match what is written in the contracts they were given to sign. And where is this ledger now? In Cheyenne, in a locked drawer in the room I let above the dry goods store, unless whoever has been asking after me these past 2 days has found it first. The judge's jaw tightened. That is precisely my concern. Word reached me yesterday, through channels I trust, that there is now a private bounty of $1,000 offered for your silence, Miss Graves, or failing that, for your person, delivered to a man who does not intend to bring you before any court. The offer did not come with Bridges' name attached to it, but I have been circuit judge in this territory long enough to smell his hand on a thing even when his fingers don't show. Simon went very still in his chair. $1,000, he repeated, which is twice what I was promised for the woman I mistakenly roped this morning, Simon said, with a grim sort of humor that did not reach his eyes. It seems the going rate for Miss Graves's inconvenience has gone up considerably since sunrise. The land auction is set for 1 week from today, the judge continued, when the Improvement Corporation intends to sell off the parcels they have already secured to Eastern buyers, sight unseen, at the courthouse in Larkspur Valley proper, with half the territory's speculators expected to attend. If Miss Graves can retrieve her evidence and bring it before that auction, along with sworn testimony from the families who were misled, I can halt the sale and force a proper accounting of the water rights. If she cannot, this valley belongs to men who have never seen it, and every family in it will be scattered to the wind within the year. And you want me, Simon said slowly, to escort her to Cheyenne and back. I want you to keep her alive long enough to finish what she started, the judge corrected. You have a reputation, Mr. Lockhart, whatever your true trade, for being a man who can move quiet through country other men find loud. Miss Graves has a reputation for being unable to leave a wrong unexamined, even when examining it might get her killed. Between the two of you, I am hoping for a combination of caution and persistence sufficient to the task. I don't need a bodyguard, Alberta said. You needed one about 2 hours ago, Simon said, when a man with a rope and a bad description nearly hauled you to Cheyenne in irons. That was your doing, not some assassin's. Which ought to tell you how easy it is for a stranger to get close enough to do you real harm, if a fool like me could manage it by accident. She opened her mouth to argue further and then, visibly, reconsidered. Simon watched the calculation move across her face, watched her weigh her pride against the plain arithmetic of the danger, and found himself unexpectedly moved by the fact that she did the sum honestly instead of simply arguing to win. Fine, she said. But I give the orders regarding the evidence and the interviews. You handle the horses and whatever violence proves necessary. I am not your baggage, Mr. Lockhart, and I will not be treated as such. I never treat a horse as baggage either, Simon said. I find they work better when they believe themselves partners in the enterprise. I am not a horse. No, he agreed, and something in his gray eyes softened in a way that made her suddenly, uncomfortably aware of how close together their chairs had drifted during the argument. You are considerably more trouble than any horse I have met, Miss Graves, and I have met some genuine devils. The judge cleared his throat pointedly. If you two are quite finished courting, we have a week and a great deal of ground to cover. They left Larkspur Valley within the hour, riding north toward Cheyenne beneath a sky that had begun, grudgingly, to clear. The road to Cheyenne ran some 60 miles north and east through country still gripped by the last hard fingers of winter, even as spring worked at the valley floors. And Simon Lockhart set a pace that balanced speed against the plain fact that the horses were picking their way through mud that could swallow a hoof to the fetlock in the wrong stretch of trail. They spoke little in the first hours, both of them still raw from the morning's violence, But Alberta found herself watching him when she thought he would not notice. The easy competence with which he read the ground ahead, the way he slowed his own horse without seeming to think about it whenever her borrowed mare grew skittish at a rushing culvert or a startled jackrabbit. "You said horses were your trade," she said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough to grow companionable rather than merely awkward. "Not bounty hunting. Bounty hunting is a debt I am paying off to a friend who once did me a kindness I could not repay any other way," Simon said. "Horse training is what puts food on my table and has done since I was 17 years old. Frightened animals mostly. The ones other trainers have given up on, the ones folks call ruined." "And are they ruined?" "Rarely," he said. "Most times what looks like meanness in a horse is fear wearing a hard face. You give a frightened animal time enough and patience enough, it generally comes around to trusting you, provided you never once give it cause to believe you'll hurt it the way whatever came before you did." That sounds like more philosophy than horsemanship. Might be there isn't so much difference between the two as folks like to think. He glanced sideways at her, a faint smile pulling at one corner of his mouth. "You write all this down in that notebook of yours, or is a horse trainer's philosophy beneath a journalist's interest?" "I write down what serves the story," she said, though she found herself, despite that answer, filing his words away in some private ledger that had nothing to do with Halloran Bridge or the Larkspur Improvement and Investment Corporation. They made camp that first night in a stand of cottonwoods above a smaller creek, its banks likewise swollen with the melt, and Simon built a fire with the economical motions of a man who had built 1,000 fires in 1,000 indifferent places, while Alberta sat cross-legged on her bedroll and worked at reconstructing, from memory, the pages of her notebook that the creek had ruined. "Tell me about Halloran Bridge," Simon said, settling across the fire from her with a tin cup of coffee in each hand, offering her one. "If I'm to keep you breathing this week, I ought to understand exactly what manner of man wants you dead." "He is not a man who wants anyone dead with his own hands," Alberta said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "He is a man who wants a great many things to happen at a comfortable distance from himself, so that his own hands stay clean enough to shake at church suppers. I met him twice, under a false name, posing as a widow considering an investment. He is charming. He is patient. He speaks of the Valley families with what sounds like real sympathy, right up until the moment he explains why their loss is, regrettably, unavoidable." "How did you come to suspect him?" "A woman I interviewed in Cheyenne, a clerk who worked in the land office before she was let go for reasons that were never fully explained to her, came to me with a rumor that certain filings had been altered after the fact. I began pulling records. The pattern took shape slowly, and then all at once, the way these things do." She stared into the fire. "3 valleys, Mr. Lockhart. Perhaps 40 families, all told, who believed they were selling their land for a fair price to honest buyers, and who instead sold away their water and their futures to men who will never once look upon the ground they've ruined. And you mean to stop him?" "I mean to tell the truth about him in print, where enough people can see it that he cannot simply pay it away or explain it into nothing. Whether that stops him is not entirely within my power. But I have found, in my experience, that men like Halloran Bridge fear the truth a great deal more than they fear the law, because the law can sometimes be reasoned with." Simon studied her across the fire for a long moment, the flames throwing shifting light across the strong, unbowed line of her jaw, and felt something settle in his chest that he had not felt in a good many years, a kind of recognition, as though he had been searching for a particular face without knowing it and had only just now found it. "My friend who asked this favor of me," he said slowly, "his name is Ezra Coombs, runs a ranch outside Cheyenne. 2 years back the bank nearly took his spread from him over a filing error that wasn't his doing, and it took him 8 months, and every dollar he had to untangle it. When I think on what your Mr. Bridge is doing to 40 families at once, I find myself considerably less troubled about breaking my word to Ezra and helping you instead. You would give up $500 for a stranger's cause. I never wanted the $500, Simon said. I wanted to help a friend, and I find I'm rather more interested now in helping you. He said it plainly, without flourish, and Alberta felt the words land somewhere beneath her ribs with more weight than such a simple sentence ought to carry. You hardly know me, Mr. Lockhart. I know you didn't flinch when I put a rope around you and a gun near your head, he said. I know you were more concerned about your ruined notebook than your own bruises. I know you've spent 6 weeks chasing a dangerous truth through 3 separate valleys, with nobody riding at your back to catch you if you fell. A man doesn't need to know a great deal more than that to recognize somebody worth riding beside. She did not answer that directly, though she found she could not quite meet his eyes for a moment, and busied herself instead with the ruined pages of her notebook, until the silence between them settled into something warmer than it had been. They reached the outskirts of Cheyenne by midday on the second day. The town sprawled along the Union Pacific line in a haze of coal smoke and horse dust, its streets thick with mud from the melt and busy, with the particular energy of a railroad town shaking off winter. Alberta led them to the dry goods store where she had let a room above the shop under the name Miss A. Graves, journalist, and it was there, on the stairs leading up to that room, that the second confrontation of the week found them. The man waiting outside her door was broad through the shoulders, dressed like a drover but carrying himself with the coiled stillness of someone accustomed to worse work than herding cattle. And when he saw Alberta come up the stairs, his hand moved toward his coat with a speed that told Simon everything he needed to know about the man's intentions before a single word passed between them. "Down," Simon said, and shoved Alberta hard sideways into the narrow hallway, even as the drum of a gunshot cracked through the close air of the stairwell, the bullet splintering wood from the banister where her head had been a half-second before. Simon's own pistol was in his hand before the echo faded, and he fired once, aiming not to kill but to disable, catching the man high in the shoulder and sending him stumbling back against the door frame with a cry of pain and surprise. The pistol dropped from the man's fingers and clattered down the stairs. "Who sent you?" Simon said, closing the distance in 3 long strides and pinning the wounded man against the wall with a forearm across his chest, his voice gone flat and cold in a way Alberta had not yet heard from him. The man only groaned and clutched at his shoulder, blood already darkening his shirt, and it became clear soon enough that he was hired muscle of the cheap and disposable variety, a man who knew a name and a price and precious little else. He gave up, between gasps of pain, that he had been approached 2 days prior by a stranger in a Cheyenne saloon, offered $50 in advance and the promise of more to follow, and told only that a journalist named Graves was to be silenced before she could testify anywhere, and that speed mattered more than cleanliness. "Bridge doesn't hire his own killing done," Alberta said grimly, once the man had been handed over to the town marshal, along with an account of events that left out certain details about warrants and bounty papers that would only complicate matters. "He pays a stranger to pay a stranger. That is precisely how a man like him has stayed respectable for so long." Her hands, Simon noticed, were trembling slightly now that the danger had passed, the calm she had projected during the confrontation itself finally cracking at the edges. "You did well," he said quietly, guiding her toward a chair in the dry goods store's back room while the shopkeeper's wife fussed over tea neither of them particularly wanted. "Most folks freeze up and tire the first time a gun goes off that close." "I have been shot at before," Alberta admitted, "though never quite so near my own front door. Mr. Bridge is clearly better financed than I had credited him." She looked up at Simon, and something in her expression had shifted since the stairwell, some wall lowered that had not been lowered before. "Thank you. That is twice now you have kept me from serious harm in as many days, and I have not yet properly thanked you for either occasion." "You don't owe me thanks. I put you in danger from that first rope, and I mean to see you safely through whatever comes of it. That's not a debt you owe me, Miss Graves. It's simply a thing I intend to do." "You could still walk away," she said. "The judge asked you to keep me alive to the hearing, not to take bullets in stairwells on my behalf." "I could," Simon agreed. "I find, though, that I don't much want to." Something passed between them in that quiet back room, thick with the smell of dry goods and spilled tea. Something neither of them named aloud, but which both of them felt, unmistakably, settle into the growing space between distrust and something considerably warmer. They retrieved the ledger from its locked drawer that evening, finding it thankfully undisturbed, and spent 2 careful hours by lamplight copying its most damning pages a second time, in case the original should be lost or stolen before the auction. Alberta explained each entry as she copied it, the dates of the water rights filing, the dates of the land purchase offers that followed, the discrepancy between the two that proved intent rather than mere oversight. And Simon found himself absorbing not just the facts, but the particular fierce clarity of her mind at work. The way she laid out an argument, the way he might read the ground before a river crossing, checking each stone for the weight it could bear before trusting it beneath a horse's hoof. "You would have made a fine lawyer," he said, watching her arrange the copied pages in order of importance. "I considered it once," Alberta said. "There is no law school in this territory that would have me, and precious few east of here inclined to admit a woman regardless. So I write instead, and I have found that a well-placed article can sometimes accomplish what a courtroom cannot, because a courtroom can be bought and a newspaper, if it has any honor left in it, generally cannot. And if this newspaper of yours proves not to have honor enough, then I find another paper, and another after that, until the truth outruns every man trying to bury it." She looked up at him, lamplight catching the fierce brightness in her dark eyes. "I have never yet met a lie large enough that persistence couldn't eventually wear it down." "I believe that," Simon said, and meant it entirely. They left Cheyenne before dawn the following morning, the ledger and its copies divided between 2 separate saddlebags in case one should be lost, and turned their horses south again toward Larkspur Valley with 4 days remaining before the auction, and unbeknownst to either of them yet, considerably more danger waiting along the road than the single wounded gunman they had already left behind. The trouble found them at a swollen ford some 15 miles south of Cheyenne, where a normally placid creek had become, in the space of 2 weeks of hard melt, a brown and violent thing eating at its own banks. Simon studied the water for a long moment, judging its speed and depth against the strength of their horses, while Alberta sat her mare with visible impatience. "We could lose half a day going around to the bridge crossing," she said. "We could lose considerably more than half a day if that current takes a horse off its feet in the middle of the ford," Simon said. "I have seen good animals drown in less water than that, and good riders with them." It was, in the end, neither the ford nor the water that nearly killed them that afternoon, but the 3 riders who came out of the cottonwoods on the ford's far bank, just as Simon had decided the crossing was, with care, survivable. He saw them before Alberta did, 3 men spread in a loose line, rifles held with the casual readiness of men who had done this sort of work before, and his stomach dropped even as his hand found his own rifle in its saddle scabbard. "Ride," he said, low and urgent. "Back the way we came, now." But the men on the far bank had clearly anticipated exactly this response, for even as Alberta wheeled her mare, there came the crack of a rifle shot from the trees behind them as well, cutting off retreat, the bullet kicking up a spray of mud not 3 feet from her horse's forelegs. They were caught, Simon realized with the cold clarity that came over him in moments of real danger, between the flooded creek and a rifle at their backs, with 3 more guns waiting on the far side should they somehow manage the crossing. "The creek," he said. "It's our only road out of this. Simon, that current will drown us. Maybe. The men behind us surely will." He looked at her, and in that look passed an entire conversation neither of them had time to speak aloud, a question and an answer both, trust asked for and trust given in the space of a single held breath. Follow my line exactly. Don't fight the horse if the water takes her sideways. Let her find her own footing. Just stay in the saddle and stay low. He put his own horse into the water first, angling upstream of the true crossing to account for the current's drag, and felt the animal shudder and fight for purchase the moment the flood took hold of its legs. Behind him, he heard Alberta's mare hit the water with a great splash, heard Alberta's voice, tight with fear but controlled, urging the animal forward rather than fighting it. A rifle shot cracked from the bank behind them, then another, the shots going wide as the shooter's angle was spoiled by the movement of water and horse alike. And Simon put every ounce of his skill into keeping his own mount's head pointed true against the pull of the current, glancing back constantly to be certain Alberta's mare had not been swept off its feet. Halfway across, her horse stumbled on a submerged stone and went down hard on one knee, pitching Alberta forward against its neck with a cry that Simon heard even over the roar of the water. For one terrible instant he thought she would go under, swept downstream toward the tangle of driftwood piled against the next bend. But she caught herself against the horse's mane, and the animal, trained well enough to know its own survival depended on regaining its feet, scrambled upright again and lunged the final yards toward the far bank. The three men waiting there had scattered at the sight of the flood crossing, unwilling or unable to hold their position against two riders coming through the water at speed, and Simon put a shot near enough to one of them to send him diving for cover rather than aiming true, more interested in clearing a path than in killing a man he did not know. They came up out of the water on the far side soaked through and shaking, horses blowing hard, and did not slow again until they had put 2 miles of hard riding between themselves and the ford, finally drawing up in a stand of pine where the ground rose steep enough to give a clear view of the trail behind them. No one had followed. Whether the men had judged the flooded creek too dangerous to cross in pursuit, or whether they had simply been paid for an ambush and not for a chase, Simon could not say, but the trail behind them stayed empty, and slowly his heartbeat began to settle back toward something ordinary. Alberta was shaking, he saw, not merely from the cold of the creek water soaking her clothes but from something deeper, some delayed reckoning with how close the afternoon had come to ending very differently. "You are unhurt?" he asked, swinging down from his own horse to check hers for injury, running his hands along the mare's foreleg where she had stumbled. "Wet and thoroughly frightened but unhurt," Alberta said, and then, in a smaller voice than he had yet heard from her, "That was closer than I would like to admit." "It was," Simon agreed. He did not try to soften it with false comfort, and she seemed to appreciate that honesty, some of the rigid tension in her shoulders easing as though his refusal to lie to her was itself a kind of reassurance. He built a small fire in the shelter of the pines, enough to dry their clothes and warm them through, though he kept it small and well hidden against the possibility of pursuit, and they sat close together in its meager warmth as the afternoon light faded toward evening. "I have been thinking," Alberta said, after a long silence, "about why you did that, rode into the water rather than trying to fight your way past the men behind us." "There were 3 guns behind and a flooded creek ahead," Simon said. "Water doesn't aim, men do." "That is not what I meant." She looked at him directly, her dark hair still damp and curling loose from its pins, firelight warm on her face. "You could have gone alone, left me to whatever those men wanted and ridden clear yourself. You are, by your own account, no lawman, owe nothing to Judge Whitfield, and have already been shot at once on my behalf. Any sensible man would have begun weighing the cost of this by now." "I have weighed it," Simon said quietly. "I weighed it back in that stairwell in Cheyenne, if I'm honest with you, and I weighed it again just now in that water. Each time I come out with the same sum." He met her eyes across the small fire, and there was nothing guarded left in his expression, only a plain and unadorned honesty that made her breath catch. "I have spent the better part of 10 years alone, Miss Graves, riding from one job to the next, gentling other men's horses, sleeping in other men's barns, never staying long enough anywhere to be missed when I left. I told myself that was simply the shape my life had taken, the price of the work I chose. But I have known you 3 days now, and I find I have stopped thinking about the next job entirely. I find I am only thinking about you, and about keeping you alive long enough that I might have the chance to know you longer than a week. Alberta was silent for a long moment, the fire popping softly between them, and when she finally spoke her voice was unsteady in a way she seemed almost embarrassed by. I have spent a good deal of my own life alone as well, she said. By choice, mostly, or so I have told myself. A woman who chases stories the way I do does not make an easy companion for most men, who want a wife content to stay put and mind a household rather than one who disappears for weeks, chasing corrupt land agents across 3 territories. I have never once thought I wanted a woman who would stay put, Simon said. I think I would find that considerably duller than the alternative. She laughed then, a genuine sound that surprised them both with its warmth, and something in the careful distance they had both been maintaining finally, gently, gave way. This is a poor time to be discovering such things about ourselves, she said, with a bounty on my head and 4 days left before an auction that may determine the fate of an entire valley. Perhaps, Simon said. Or perhaps it is precisely the sort of week that shows a person most clearly who they truly are, and what they truly want, once all the ordinary pretenses have burned away. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, her fingers still cold from the creek water, and did not let go even as the fire burned low, and neither of them spoke again of the danger waiting down the road, content for that one evening to simply exist together in the quiet, fire-lit dark. They rode the remaining days toward Larkspur Valley with a new and careful tenderness between them, though the danger did not relent to accommodate their courtship. Word had clearly gone ahead of them, whether through the wounded gunman's associates or through some other channel Alberta could not identify, and twice more they were forced to alter their route, once to avoid a rider who seemed to be watching the main road with more interest than an idle traveler should show, and once to ford a smaller creek at an awkward hour of night, rather than risk a bridge crossing where a man could have too easy a shot from cover. Through it all, Simon proved himself exactly as capable as the judge had promised, reading trouble in the land and the weather and the behavior of strangers before it fully announced itself. And Alberta found herself leaning on that capability not as a woman leans on rescue, but as one partner leans on another whose skills complement her own. She, in turn, proved herself equally essential, for it was her sharp memory that recalled a shortcut through a rancher's back pasture that saved them a full day's ride, and her steady nerve that talked down a suspicious homesteader who nearly turned a shotgun on them when they sought shelter from a sudden hailstorm, using nothing but calm words and the judge's name to secure a night's safe lodging in the man's barn. By the evening of the 6th day, they crested the last ridge above Larkspur Valley with the ledger and its copies intact, 3 separate attempts on Alberta's life or liberty behind them, and something unspoken but entirely understood now settled between them, a partnership that had become, somewhere along those muddy 60 miles, considerably more than mere partnership. They found Larkspur Valley in a state of quiet, coiled tension. Judge Whitfield had spread word discreetly among the families who had been approached by the Improvement Corporation, and a dozen of them, the Ray's family among them, had agreed to attend the auction and offer testimony if called upon, though fear ran high enough that several had asked their names be kept from any public record until the outcome of the hearing was assured. Halloran Bridge himself arrived in town the day before the auction, and Alberta caught her first sight of him from the window of the boarding house where she and Simon had taken separate rooms at the judge's insistence, for propriety's sake, though neither of them had slept easily in the night since the ford, each too aware of the other's nearness through the thin walls. Bridge was, as Alberta had described him, entirely unremarkable in appearance, A man of middle years with a pleasant, forgettable face and clothes, just fine enough to suggest respectability without inviting envy. He moved through the town's single street shaking hands and inquiring after the health of children he had clearly never met, and Alberta felt her stomach turn at the easy fluency of his performance. "That is the man who has ordered my death twice over," she said quietly, "and he greets the mercantile owner like an old friend." "Men like that always do," Simon said. "It is precisely how they escape suspicion for as long as they do." That evening, Judge Whitfield called them both to his chambers a final time to review the plan for the following day's auction. "The sale is set to open at 10 o'clock, the judge said. "Bridge intends to auction the parcels to a room full of Eastern speculators who have traveled here specifically for the purpose, sight unseen, on the strength of his company's promises. I have arranged to preside over the proceedings myself, which gives us the opening we need. When the bidding reaches its height, Miss Graves, you will be recognized to present your evidence before the court, and I will halt the sale pending investigation of the water rights filing." "And if Bridge attempts to prevent that recognition," Simon asked, "or if his hired men attempt something more direct in a room full of witnesses?" "Then we will be glad of the marshal I have asked to attend, and of your own evident talent for keeping Miss Graves alive through worse odds than a crowded courthouse," the judge said. "But I will tell you both plainly, this is the most dangerous moment of the entire affair, precisely because it is the moment Bridge stands to lose everything at once. A desperate man in a public room is not necessarily a safer man than a desperate man on an empty road." They left the judge's chambers as the last light faded from the valley, and walked together along the muddy main street toward the boarding house, neither of them quite ready yet to part for the night. "Tomorrow this ends, one way or another," Alberta said. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Simon said, stopping beneath the boarding house's small overhang, rain beginning to patter softly against the roof shingles above them, "I want you to know that I do not intend for it to end anything between us. Whatever comes of the auction, whatever comes of Bridge and his company and the water rights, I find I am no longer interested in returning to the life I had before I met you, riding alone from one job to the next with no one waiting anywhere for me to come home. Simon." Her voice caught on his name, and she looked up at him in the gray evening light, rain beginning to darken her dark hair. "I have built my whole life around never needing to be rescued by anyone. I do not know how to be the sort of woman who simply waits at home for a man to return to her." "I have never once asked you to be that woman," Simon said. "I would not want her if you were. I want you exactly as you are, Alberta Graves, chasing your stories and refusing your rescues and arguing with me about who gives the orders on a dangerous road. I only want the chance to do all of that beside you, rather than watching you ride off toward the next danger alone, while I go back to gentling some stranger's horse in some stranger's barn." She reached up then and touched his face, rain damp and weathered beneath her fingers, and he turned his head just enough to press a kiss to her palm before drawing her closer. And when their lips finally met, it was without hesitation, without the careful distance either of them had maintained through days of danger and growing tenderness. A kiss that tasted of rain and relief, and a hope neither of them had quite dared name aloud until that moment. "Whatever tomorrow brings," Alberta murmured against his mouth when they finally parted, "I find I am no longer interested in facing it without you beside me either." They stood together beneath the overhang a long while, rain falling soft and steady around them, the valley quiet but for the distant rush of the swollen creek. And for that one stolen hour neither Halloran Bridge nor his bounty, nor the auction waiting with the dawn seemed quite so large as the simple fact of two lonely people who had, against every likelihood, found each other in the mud and danger of a Wyoming spring. The Larkspur Valley Courthouse filled to capacity well before 10 o'clock the following morning, the muddy street outside crowded with horses and wagons belonging to speculators from as far as Denver and Omaha, drawn by the promise of fertile bottomland at bargain prices. Alberta sat near the back of the room beside Simon, the ledger and its copies secured in a leather satchel across her lap, watching Halloran Bridge move among the gathered buyers with his easy, practiced charm. Judge Whitfield took his seat at the front of the room precisely on the hour, and the auction began in ordinary enough fashion, parcel after parcel called out and bid upon by eager buyers who had never walked the ground they were purchasing. Alberta felt her pulse climbing with each successive sale, watching the valley's future being auctioned away piece by piece to men who would never know or care that the water beneath that land had already been stolen from beneath the feet of its rightful families. It was when the auctioneer called the parcel belonging to the Rays family, a broad stretch of bottomland that included the best of the creek frontage, that Judge Whitfield rose from his seat and raised a hand for silence. "Before this sale proceeds further," the judge said, his voice carrying easily through the crowded room, "I am obliged to recognize new evidence that bears directly on the legitimacy of these proceedings. Miss Alberta Graves, journalist, please come forward." A murmur rippled through the courthouse as Alberta rose, and she caught sight of Halloran Bridge's face in that instant, watched the practiced pleasantness drop away for just a fraction of a second to reveal something colder and more calculating beneath. "Judge, I must object," Bridge said, coming to his feet with admirable speed. "This is an auction of legally acquired property, not a forum for unsubstantiated accusations. The evidence I am about to present is very much substantiated, Mr. Bridge," Alberta said, walking to the front of the room with the satchel held firm against her side, "and I would ask that you allow the court to judge that for itself rather than assuming its conclusions in advance." She laid the copied ledger pages before the judge, walking the room through each entry with the same careful clarity she had used to explain them to Simon by lamplight days before. The water rights filing, dated 4 months before the first purchase offers went out to Valley families. The language of those offers, which promised full and unencumbered ownership of the land including its water. The discrepancy between promise and reality that could only be explained by deliberate deception. "I have with me also," she continued, "sworn statements from 6 families in this valley describing the exact terms under which they were approached, and I have located, through the Cheyenne Land Office, the original filing that reveals Mr. Bridge's company acted as agent throughout, receiving both a fee for securing the land at reduced prices and a separate fee for the water rights sold on to a consortium of investors in New York, none of whom have ever visited this territory." The room had gone entirely silent now, every eye moving between Alberta and Halloran Bridge, whose face had settled into a mask of wounded innocence that fooled no one who had watched the color drain from it moments before. "These are serious allegations built on stolen documents and second-hand rumor," Bridge said, his voice pitched to carry, appealing directly to the room of speculators who had traveled far and invested much in the day's proceedings. "I would remind the court that this woman has, by her own admission, trespassed in private business records to construct this fantasy. The records were not private, Mr. Bridge, as public filings are a matter of public record precisely, so that fraud of this nature can be exposed," Judge Whitfield said coldly. "And I would remind you that a private bounty offered against a journalist's testimony, which this court has independently confirmed originated from a man in your employ, speaks rather more to guilt than to innocence." A fresh murmur ran through the crowd at that, and Alberta saw several of the visiting speculators exchange uneasy glances, men who had come to buy land, not to become entangled in accusations of fraud and violence. It was at that moment that the courtroom doors opened once more, and a woman Alberta recognized immediately walked in, the very Cheyenne Land Office clerk who had first brought her the rumor that started this entire investigation, accompanied by an official from the Territorial Land Commission, whom Judge Whitfield had quietly summoned 2 days prior, anticipating exactly this confrontation. "I can confirm," the commission official said, once he had been recognized by the court, that the water rights filing described by Miss Graves is authentic and predates the land purchase agreements as she has stated. I can further confirm that the Larkspur Improvement and Investment Corporation's charter contains no provision permitting the separate sale of water rights independent of the land itself, which means every purchase agreement signed under these terms is subject to legal challenge, and every parcel currently offered for sale carries a defect in title that I would advise none of you to purchase until this matter is fully resolved. The room erupted into noise at that, speculators calling out questions, several already rising from their seats with the clear intention of leaving before they committed money to a sale that had just been revealed as fundamentally compromised. Halloran Bridge stood at the front of the room, his composure finally cracking entirely, his face gone pale and furious in equal measure. "This is an outrage," he said, though the words carried none of their earlier conviction. "I have investors depending on this sale, obligations that must be met." "Your investors," Judge Whitfield said, "will need to seek their remedy through proper legal channels, as will the families of this valley, whose land and water you have conspired to steal through deliberate misrepresentation. I am halting this auction effective immediately, voiding all sales concluded today, and I am ordering the arrest of Halloran Bridge on charges of fraud, and given the evidence presented regarding a bounty placed against a witness's testimony, conspiracy to commit violence as well." It happened fast after that, faster than Alberta had quite anticipated, even having lived through the week's dangers. Bridges' eyes went wild for one instant, and his hand moved toward his coat with an intention that needed no interpretation. But Simon had been watching him the entire time, positioned near enough to close the distance in 2 long strides, and he had Bridges' wrist pinned, and the small pistol wrestled from his grip before the man had fully cleared it from his coat pocket. "I would not," Simon said, low and even, twisting the weapon free and stepping back to let the town marshal move in with iron restraints, "recommend adding attempted violence in a courtroom full of witnesses to the list of charges already against you, Mr. Bridge. It tends to go poorly for a man's case." Bridge said nothing further, his face gone slack with the particular despair of a man who has watched every careful arrangement of his life collapse in the space of a few minutes, and the marshal led him from the courthouse to a chorus of angry murmurs from the very speculators who had traveled so far to enrich themselves at the valley's expense. The auction, of course, did not resume. Judge Whitfield adjourned the proceedings with a formal declaration that all pending sales were void, until the water rights matter could be properly resolved by the Territorial Land Commission, a process that would take some months, but which, with the fraud now exposed and documented, left little doubt as to its eventual outcome. The families of Larkspur Valley, the Rays family among them, would keep their land and their water both, their futures no longer hostage to a scheme built on distant investors' ignorance and a respectable man's careful lies. Alberta stood in the emptying courthouse afterward, the ledger pages gathered back into her satchel, and felt the accumulated exhaustion of the week finally catch up with her all at once, her hands beginning to shake now that the danger had, at last, genuinely passed. Simon appeared at her side and did not ask if she was well, simply took her hand and held it, steady and warm, until the shaking subsided. "You did it," he said quietly. "The whole valley, saved by a woman with a notebook and more courage than sense." "We did it," she corrected. "I would have been dead in that stairwell in Cheyenne, or drowned in that creek crossing, or shot in this very courtroom just now, had you not been beside me at every one of those moments." "I told you," Simon said, "I never once thought of it as a debt to be repaid. I did it because I could not imagine doing otherwise, not once I came to know you." Outside the courthouse, the valley lay green and muddy and very much alive under a sky finally clearing after a week of low gray cloud, the creek still running high with the melt, but no longer a thing of danger. Simply the ordinary business of a Wyoming spring bringing water down from the mountains to feed the fields below. Tomas Reyes found them on the courthouse steps, his father close behind him, both men's faces bright with a relief and gratitude too large for easy words. "You have saved our family's whole future, Miss Graves," the elder Reyes said, taking her hand in both of his own weathered ones. "Our water, our land, our children's inheritance, all of it. I do not know how a family repays such a debt. You owe me nothing but the courage you have already shown, coming forward to testify when it would have been safer to stay silent," Alberta said. "That took more bravery than anything I did with a notebook and a stack of copied papers." The Valley families gathered slowly on the courthouse steps and along the muddy street as word spread of the auction's collapse and Bridges' arrest. A crowd that had arrived that morning, fearing the loss of everything they had built, now standing instead in the thin spring sunshine, with the particular disbelieving joy of people who had braced for disaster and received deliverance instead. Someone produced a fiddle from somewhere, and within the hour what had begun as a courtroom confrontation had transformed into something very like a celebration, spilling out across the town's single muddy street. Judge Whitfield found Simon and Alberta standing somewhat apart from the gathering crowd, near the swollen creek at the edge of town, and regarded them both with the shrewd, not unkind expression of a man who had presided over more than his share of frontier romances alongside his frontier justice. "I believe my order for the two of you to travel together has been more thoroughly fulfilled than I ever anticipated when I issued it," the judge said dryly. "Your order nearly got us both killed 3 separate times, Judge," Simon said, though there was no real complaint in it. "And yet here you both stand, alive, and looking considerably more attached to one another than either of you were a week ago, unless my eyes deceive me entirely." The judge's weathered face creased into something like a smile. "I have signed off on stranger outcomes in my years on this circuit, Mr. Lockhart, but few I have been gladder to witness." "I owe you an apology as well, Judge," Simon said, "for the manner in which this business began. I ought never to have been fool enough to rope an innocent woman off her horse on a false description." "You ought not," the judge agreed. "Though I confess I find myself, on reflection, grateful for your particular brand of foolishness, since it is precisely what put the two of you on the road together in the first place, and I doubt this valley's families would have found their justice near so surely without both of you working in concert." He left them there beside the creek, walking back toward the gathering celebration, and Alberta turned to Simon with an expression caught somewhere between laughter and something far more tender. "He is not wrong," she said. "For all that it began with a rope and a mistake and a bruise across my shoulders that took a full week to fade, I would not trade the week that followed for anything." "Nor would I," Simon said, drawing her close against the cool spring air rising off the flooding creek. "Though I intend to spend a good deal of time going forward making up for that first rough introduction, if you will permit me the chance." "And what would that making up look like, precisely?" "For one thing," Simon said, "I do not intend to leave this valley without you, unless you order me off it yourself, which I hope you will not." "I have no intention of ordering you anywhere, Simon Lockhart, except perhaps closer." She reached up and drew his face down to hers, and this kiss held none of the desperate uncertainty of the one beneath the boarding-house overhang 2 nights prior, only a settled, certain warmth, the particular sweetness of two people who have weathered genuine danger together and found, on the other side of it, that what remains between them is something worth building an entire life around. They stayed in Larkspur Valley through the remainder of that spring, as the flooded creeks settled back into their banks and the mud dried enough for the roads to properly reopen, and as the newborn calves grew steady enough on their legs to range the greening pastures without their mothers standing quite so close. Simon found ready work gentling the valley's horses, several of the local ranchers having heard already, through the fast-traveling gossip of a small frontier town, of the patient skill he had shown not only with frightened animals, but with a woman who had needed, in her own way, to learn to trust a stranger riding beside her through danger. Alberta stayed to see the water rights matter fully resolved before the Territorial Land Commission, her testimony and evidence proving decisive in restoring clear title to every family Bridges Company had wronged. And she wrote, in the weeks that followed, the fullest and most damning account yet published of Halloran Bridges' scheme, an article that ran not only in the Denver Republican but was picked up and reprinted in papers as far as Chicago, ensuring that Bridges' eventual trial would proceed under a glare of public attention no quiet bribe could dim. Bridge himself, facing charges of fraud and conspiracy that his considerable resources could not entirely buy away given the strength of the evidence, and the public attention now fixed upon the case, was eventually convicted and sentenced to serve a term in the territorial prison, his company's charter revoked, his investors left to absorb the losses that ought properly to have fallen on families who had never done anything more than trust a respectable man's word. On a warm afternoon in early June, with the valley's fields gone thick and green, and the creek running clear and gentle within its banks once more, Simon Lockhart found Alberta Graves sitting on the porch of the small house they had begun, in the weeks since the auction, to speak of building together on a modest parcel of land at the valley's eastern edge, a place with good water and good grazing, and a view clear down the length of the valley they had saved. "I have a question for you," Simon said, settling onto the porch step beside her, "and I find myself considerably more nervous asking it than I was facing down 3 armed men at a flooded creek crossing." "That seems an unfair comparison to set for yourself," Alberta said, though her eyes had already gone soft and knowing, as though she suspected exactly what question was coming. "I have spent 10 years alone, Alberta, moving from one job to the next with nothing to come home to and no one waiting on me when I left. I told myself that was simply the price of the work, and I believed it, right up until a woman with more courage than sense wandered into my path with a bounty on her head and a notebook full of other men's secrets." He took her hand in both of his own, weathered and steady, the same hands that had gentled 100 frightened horses now trembling faintly with a nervousness no frightened animal had ever caused him. "I do not want to spend the next 10 years the same way I spent the last 10. I want to build something here, in this valley we fought so hard to save, and I do not want to build it alone. Alberta Graves, will you marry me?" She did not answer immediately, and for one heart-stopping moment Simon feared he had misjudged the whole of it. But then he saw the tears standing bright in her dark eyes, and understood they were tears of the good kind, the kind that come when a person finally receives the very thing they had stopped allowing themselves to hope for. "I spent a great many years believing a woman like me, chasing stories and stubborn causes across half the territory, had no business wanting a home or a husband both," she said, her voice thick with feeling. "I believed I would have to choose, eventually, between the work that gives my life its purpose and the kind of belonging most people take for granted." "You have never once asked me to choose, Simon. You have only ever asked to stand beside me while I do both." "That is the only kind of asking I would ever want to do," Simon said. "I fell in love with the whole of you, Alberta, the journalist and the fighter, and the woman who refuses every rescue except the ones offered freely between equals. I would not have you any other way, and I would not want to spend my life with any other woman." "Then yes," Alberta said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Simon Lockhart, I will marry you, though I warn you now I intend to keep writing and keep chasing stories, and keep arguing with you about who gives the orders on any road we travel together." "I would expect nothing less," Simon said, and kissed her there on the porch step in the warm June sunshine, the valley spread green and thriving before them, saved from ruin by the very partnership now sealing itself into something permanent. They married 3 weeks later in the small church at the center of Larkspur Valley, with Judge Whitfield himself presiding over the ceremony at their particular request, and the entire valley turned out for the occasion, the Rays family and the Haversons, and a dozen other families whose land and water had been secured through Alberta's investigation and Simon's protection both. All of them gathered to celebrate the union of two people who had, through one dangerous and transformative week, found in each other exactly what neither had known they were still searching for. Simon Lockhart never did collect the $500 he had once ridden north hoping to earn, nor did he ever again take up bounty work of any kind, finding that his true calling had been waiting for him all along in the patient work of gentling frightened creatures, and as it turned out, in the considerably more complicated work of loving a fiercely independent woman well enough to earn her trust rather than demanding it. He built his horse training business into the finest in the valley over the years that followed, known far and wide for his particular gift, with animals other trainers had given up as ruined, a reputation that only grew once word spread of the bounty hunter who had given up chasing fugitives to spend his days instead teaching broken creatures, both four-legged and otherwise, that they were safe at last. Alberta Graves kept writing, exactly as she had promised, her articles on land fraud and frontier justice earning her a reputation across the territory as a journalist whose word could be trusted precisely, because she had proven, in the most dangerous week of her life, that she would rather face down a bounty in a flooded creek and a courtroom full of powerful men than let a single lie stand unchallenged. She never again needed to travel those investigations alone, for Simon rode beside her on every dangerous story that followed, no longer a bounty hunter tracking the wrong woman but a husband who had found, in that very mistake, the truest reason of his life to finally come home. And on quiet evenings in the house they built together at the valley's eastern edge, with the creek running gentle past their door and the horses Simon trained grazing peaceful in the pasture beyond, Alberta would sometimes tease him about that first violent morning beside Sweetwater Creek, the rope and the manacle and the terrible bounty notice with its wrong description. "You very nearly hauled me all the way to Cheyenne in irons," she would say, "over a woman with the wrong hair color entirely. I have been grateful for that mistake every single day since," Simon would answer, drawing her close against the warm evening air, "for it was the wrong woman I set out chasing, and the right one I found instead, and I would not trade that particular error for anything this world could offer me." And she would laugh and lean into him, and the valley around them would settle into the deep peace of a place finally safe and finally whole, home at last to two people who had ridden through danger together and found, on the other side of it, the truest kind of belonging either of them had ever known.